Ryan had always been that kid who blended into the background. You know, the type sitting in the back row of music class, never raising his hand, never volunteering for anything, while other students practically jumped out of their seats to get picked for solos. Ryan kept his eyes down, his worn notebook open in front of him, filled with scribbles that looked like musical notes but could have been anything, really. His teachers noticed him, of course. How could they not? Perfect attendance for 3 years straight, but it was like he was trying to be invisible. During choir practice, he'd mouth the words along with everyone else. His voice so soft, you could barely hear it over the other 40 students in the room. Mr. Peterson. The choir director had tried a few times to get him to sing louder, but Ryan would just nod politely and continue at the same barely audible volume. The thing is, there were moments, brief, fleeting moments, when Mr. Peterson caught something different. Like that Tuesday afternoon when he'd forgotten his briefcase and came back to the music room an hour after school ended. He'd heard piano music drifting down the hallway, something classical and complicated. And when he peeked through the small window in the door, there was Ryan. His fingers were moving across the keys with this confidence that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. The shy, quiet kid had vanished, replaced by someone who understood music in a way that went beyond just reading notes on a page. But the moment Mr. Peterson opened the door, Ryan's hands froze. He looked up like a deer caught in headlights, mumbled something about practicing for an assignment, and practically ran out of the room. Mr. Peterson stood there for a moment, wondering what he'd just witnessed. He mentioned it to Ms. Williams, the music theory teacher, in passing the next day. She'd had similar experiences catching Ryan humming complex melodies under his breath. Noticing how his eyes lit up during lessons about musical composition? Even though he never participated in class discussions, spring semester of his junior year rolled around, and the school's annual talent showcase was announced. It was the biggest event of the year at Riverside High, where students got to show off everything from magic tricks to breakdancing. The sign-up sheet went up on Monday morning, and by lunchtime, it was already half full. Singers, dancers, comedians, everyone wanted their moment in the spotlight. Ryan walked past that sign-up sheet every day for a week. He'd slow down, glance at it, then keep walking. On Friday afternoon, with only 2 hours left before sign-ups closed, something changed. Maybe it was the way the spring sun was hitting the hallway. Or maybe it was the memory of a promise he'd made to someone important. Whatever it was, Ryan picked up the pen hanging from the clipboard and wrote his name at the very bottom of the list. Mr. Peterson was reviewing the sign-ups in his office when he saw it. Ryan Chen's solo performance. He blinked, read it again, then called Ms. Williams into his office. They both stared at the name like it was written in a foreign language. "Do you think he knows what he's signing up for?" Ms. Williams asked, genuine concern in her voice. "I've seen so many kids freeze up on that stage. Remember Thompson last year? Couldn't get a single word out." Mr. Peterson nodded slowly. They'd both been teaching long enough to know that stage fright could crush even the most confident students. And Ryan was the opposite of confident. But there was something about those brief moments they'd witnessed, those glimpses of something deeper, that made them curious. Over the weekend, they talked it through. They'd seen too many students embarrass themselves, too many kids who thought they were ready, but weren't. If Ryan was going to do this, they needed to know he could handle it. Not just for the sake of the showcase, but for his own sake. The last thing they wanted was to see this quiet kid's confidence shattered in front of the entire school. Monday afternoon, they asked Ryan to stay after class. He looked worried as he approached Mr. Peterson's desk, his backpack hanging from one shoulder, his eyes darting between both teachers like he was trying to figure out what he'd done wrong. "Ryan," Mr. Peterson started, keeping his voice gentle, "we saw you signed up for the talent showcase." Ryan nodded, not quite meeting their eyes. "That's great," Ms. Williams added quickly, seeing the nervousness on his face. "We're happy you want to participate, but we need to talk about what that means." They led him to the music room, the same room where Mr. Peterson had caught him playing piano months ago. The afternoon sun was streaming through the tall windows, dust particles floating in the beams of light. There were about 30 chairs set up in rows, music stands scattered around. A grand piano in the corner that the school had somehow managed to afford 10 years ago Mr. Peterson gestured for Ryan to sit, but he remained standing, still clutching his backpack strap like it was a life preserver. The teachers exchanged a look. This was going to be harder than they thought. "Ryan, performing in front of an audience is different from singing in class," Mr. Peterson said. "The auditorium will be packed. Parents, students, teachers, everyone watching, everyone listening. It can be overwhelming. We've seen very talented students struggle up there," Ms. Williams continued, "and we just want to make sure you're ready. That you really want to do this?" Ryan was quiet for a long moment. His teachers watched as something shifted in his expression, a flicker of something that looked almost like determination, though it was hard to tell with someone who kept their emotions so carefully hidden. "I want to do this," he finally said, his voice quiet but steady. "What are you planning to perform?" Mr. Peterson asked. Ryan hesitated, then reached into his backpack. He pulled out a folder, worn at the edges, the kind that looked like it had been opened and closed 1,000 times. From inside, he carefully extracted a piece of sheet music. His hands trembled slightly as he handed it to Mr. Peterson. The choir director looked at the music, his eyebrows rising. He passed it to Ms. Williams, who had the same reaction. They looked at Ryan, then back at the sheet music, then at Ryan again. "Ryan," Ms. Williams said carefully, "do you know what this is?" He nodded. "Have you ever sung this before?" "At home," he said quietly. "A lot." Mr. Peterson sat down heavily in one of the student chairs. This changed everything. This wasn't just a shy kid wanting to sing a simple song. This was something else entirely. Something that, if he could actually pull it off, would be remarkable. But if he couldn't? If he failed with something this ambitious in front of the whole school? The teachers looked at each other, having one of those silent conversations that only people who've worked together for years can have. They were thinking the same thing: this could go very, very wrong. But they were also thinking something else. Those stolen moments they'd witnessed? Those brief glimpses of someone who understood music at a deeper level, maybe, just maybe? There was more to this quiet kid than anyone had ever suspected. The question was, were they willing to find out? And more importantly, was Ryan ready for what they were about to ask him to prove? Mr. Peterson walked over to the piano and set the sheet music on the stand. The afternoon light made the notes on the page almost glow. He turned back to Ryan, who was still standing by the door, looking like he might bolt at any second. "Sit down, Ryan," Ms. Williams said, her voice softer now. "Please." Ryan finally moved, choosing a chair in the second row. Not the front, never the front, but close enough that he couldn't pretend he wasn't part of what was happening. His backpack sat on his lap like a shield. Mr. Peterson pulled up a chair and sat facing him. "Ryan, I need you to be honest with us." "Really honest? Why do you want to perform?" The question hung in the air. Ryan's fingers traced the edge of his backpack, and for a moment his teachers thought he might not answer at all. Then, quietly, almost too quietly to hear, he said, "I made a promise." "A promise?" Ms. Williams prompted gently. Ryan nodded. "To my grandmother. Before she passed away last year," teachers exchanged glances. This was new information. The school counselor had mentioned Ryan had lost a family member, but there were no details in his file about how close they'd been or how deeply it had affected him. "She taught music," Ryan continued, his voice a little stronger now. "Back in Korea, before she came here, she was a real teacher, with students and everything. But then she got sick, and her voice—" He trailed off, swallowing hard. "She couldn't sing anymore, but she still loved music. Every night, she'd play these old records. Opera, mostly. She'd tell me about each singer, each performance, like she was telling me stories." Mr. Peterson leaned forward, listening carefully. "This explains so much about the boy who'd been invisible for 3 years. She spent her last 2 years teaching me everything she knew," Ryan said. "How to read music, how to feel it, not just hear it. She'd make me listen to the same song 20 times, and each time she'd point out something different. The way a singer would breathe, the emotion in a single note. How silence could be just as powerful as sound." "That sounds like an incredible gift," Ms. Williams said softly. Ryan's eyes were getting misty, but he kept talking. The night before she went to the hospital for the last time, she made me promise her something. She said, "Don't let the music die with me. Promise you'll share it," I promised. But then I got scared. What if I wasn't good enough? What if I embarrassed her memory? The room was quiet except for the faint sound of students in the hallway outside, heading to their after-school activities. Mr. Peterson understood now. This wasn't just about a talent show. This was about grief, about love, about keeping someone's memory alive. But understanding didn't change the reality of what Ryan was attempting. Mr. Peterson stood and walked back to the piano, picking up the sheet music Ryan had brought. He looked at it again, really looked at it, and felt that familiar mixture of admiration and concern. "Ryan, do you know how difficult this piece is?" he asked, holding up the music. Ryan nodded. "My grandmother told me it's one of the hardest arias in opera. She said even professional singers mess it up sometimes." "Then why choose this one?" Ms. Williams asked. "There are beautiful pieces that would be easier, pieces that would still honor your grandmother's memory." For the first time since entering the room, Ryan looked directly at his teachers. There was something different in his eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. Because this was her favorite. She played it every single day. She said it was about refusing to give up, about believing you'll win even when everything seems impossible. That's what she did. She fought until the very end. Mr. Peterson sat back down, the sheet music in his hands. He understood Ryan's reasoning, respected it even. But as a teacher, as someone who'd seen countless students over the years, he had a responsibility. The talent showcase was in 2 weeks. 2 weeks to prepare one of the most demanding pieces in the entire opera repertoire. "Ryan," he began carefully, "I want you to understand something. This aria, Nessun Dorma, has broken the confidence of trained singers. Professionals who've studied for decades struggle with it. The range alone requires years of vocal training, the breath control, the power needed for the climax. These aren't things you can master in 2 weeks." "I know," Ryan said simply. Ms. Williams jumped in. "We're not trying to discourage you. We're trying to protect you. If you go up on that stage and can't hit the notes, if your voice cracks or you run out of breath." She paused, trying to find the right words. "High school students can be cruel, Ryan, they'll remember. Comments online, gossip in the hallways, it could follow you for the rest of your time here." "I know that too," Ryan said. Mr. Peterson stood and began pacing, a habit he had when he was thinking hard about something. "Here's what I'm proposing. We'll make this your audition piece. You have 2 weeks to prepare it. If you can perform it for us privately, and if we feel you're ready, then you can do it at the showcase. If not, we'll find you something else. Something beautiful, something meaningful, but something achievable." It was a fair compromise, they thought. It gave Ryan a goal to work toward, while also providing a safety net. They could evaluate him privately, save him from potential public embarrassment, and still let him perform something that honored his grandmother. But Ryan was shaking his head. "No alternative pieces, Ryan," Mr. Peterson started.
"Oh," Ryan said,
more firmly than they'd ever heard him speak. "This is the song. If I can't do this one, then I won't perform at all. My grandmother didn't teach me to play it safe. She taught me that music requires courage." The teacher stared at him. This quiet kid who'd spent 3 years hiding in the back of the classroom was suddenly showing a stubborn streak they never knew existed. "Ms. Williams tried a different approach. Have you sung this for anyone? Your parents? Friends?" Ryan shook his head. "Just by myself. In my room mostly. Sometimes in my grandmother's apartment after she passed. My mom kept it exactly how it was, and I go there to practice sometimes." "So you've never performed in front of anyone?" Mr. Peterson asked. "No, not even your mother. She works night shifts at the hospital," Ryan explained. "She's usually asleep when I practice in the morning, and at work when I practice at night. I didn't want to wake her. She's already so tired all the time." Mr. Peterson ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration mixed with growing respect for this kid. Everything about this situation screamed disaster. An inexperienced singer tackling an expert-level piece with no performance experience and no feedback from anyone except himself. It violated every teaching principle he'd learned in 20 years of education. But there was something else too, that determination in Ryan's eyes. The way he talked about his grandmother, about the promise he'd made, and those fleeting moments they'd witnessed the piano playing, the humming, the way Ryan's entire demeanor changed when he thought no one was watching. "Okay," Mr. Peterson said finally. "Here's the deal. 2 weeks, you practice this piece, and in exactly 14 days, you perform it for us. Just us, in this room. No audience, no pressure, just you and the two of us. You do that, and we'll know if you're ready for the showcase." "And if I'm not ready?" Ryan asked. "Then we have an honest conversation about it," Miss Williams said. "But Ryan, you have to promise us something too. You have to promise you'll really prepare. Not just singing it alone in your room, but working on technique, on projection, on stage presence. We can help you, but only if you let us." Ryan thought about it for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay, 2 weeks." He stood up, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. As he reached the door, Mr. Peterson called out to him, "Ryan, your grandmother was right about the song. It is about refusing to give up. But it's also about believing in yourself. Do you believe you can do this?" Ryan turned back, and for just a second, his teacher saw something flash across his face. Not confidence exactly, but something close to it. Something that looked like quiet determination mixed with the kind of love that doesn't fade even after someone is gone. "My grandmother believed I could," he said. "That's enough for now." And then he was gone, leaving his teachers standing in the empty music room, wondering what exactly they'd just agreed to. They'd given him an impossible challenge, expecting him to back down or compromise. Instead, he'd accepted it fully, with conditions of his own. Mr. Peterson looked at Ms. Williams. Did we just make a huge mistake? She picked up the sheet music from the piano, studying the complex notation. "I honestly don't know. But I think we're about to find out what that kid is really made of." Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the empty chairs. In 2 weeks, they'd have their answer. Either they'd have helped a student achieve something remarkable, or they'd have to pick up the pieces of a dream that crashed before it could take flight. The question was, which one would it be? The next morning, Ryan's alarm went off at 5:30. He'd barely slept, his mind racing with everything that had happened in the music room. 2 weeks. 14 days to prove he could do something that seemed impossible. He got dressed in the dark, careful not to wake his mother, who'd only gotten home from her shift. 3 hours earlier, the school was empty when he arrived at 6:15. The janitor, Mr. Lopez, looked surprised to see a student there so early, but let him in without questions. Ryan made his way through the quiet hallways, his footsteps echoing off the lockers. The building felt different at this hour, peaceful, like it was holding its breath before the chaos of the day began. He unlocked the auditorium with the key Mr. Peterson had given him the night before. "Use it wisely," the teacher had said, "and don't make me regret trusting you." The auditorium was dark, except for the emergency exit signs casting a red glow. Ryan flipped on the stage lights and stood there for a moment, looking at all the empty seats. This was where it would happen. In 2 weeks, every one of those seats would be filled with people watching him, judging him. His stomach twisted, but he pushed the feeling down. His grandmother used to say that fear was just energy that needed direction. So he directed into practice. He started with breathing exercises, the ones his grandmother had taught him. Deep breaths from the diaphragm, counting to 8, holding for 4, releasing for 8, over and over until his racing heart began to slow. Then scales, warming up his voice gradually, carefully. The acoustics in the auditorium were different from his bedroom. His voice bounced off the walls, came back to him amplified and strange. By 7:30, another student started arriving. Ryan was already dripping with sweat. He'd run through the aria 4 times, marking the spots where he struggled, where his breath ran short, where the notes didn't come out quite right. He had a notebook now, filled with observations and corrections. His grandmother had taught him that to always write it down, because your memory lies but paper doesn't. At lunch, while everyone else crowded into the cafeteria, Ryan disappeared. There were 4 practice rooms behind the music department, small soundproof boxes with a piano, a mirror, and barely enough space to turn around. He claimed the same one every day, room 3, and worked through the difficult passages over and over. The hardest part was the climax. It's the famous vincero that everyone knew even if they didn't know opera. It required hitting high notes with power while maintaining control. And every time Ryan attempted it, something went wrong. Either his voice cracked, or he ran out of breath, or the notes came out weak and thin. He'd listen to recordings on his phone, Poverati, Domingo, Bosella, trying to understand how they made it sound so effortless. One afternoon, about 4 days into his preparation, Tyler Hammond and his friends walked past the practice rooms. Tyler was one of those guys who seemed to coast through life on confidence and charm. Star of the basketball team, popular with everyone, the kind of person who never worried about fitting in because he was the definition of fitting in. "Yo, is someone dying in there?" Tyler said loudly, and his friends laughed. Ryan heard them through the door. He stopped singing, his face burning. "Dude, that's Chen," one of Tyler's friends said. "Didn't he sign up for the talent show?" "No way," Tyler said. "What's he gonna do? Bore everyone to death?" More laughter, and then their voices faded down the hallway. Ryan stood in the practice room, staring at himself in the mirror. His reflection looked tired, uncertain. For a moment, he thought about Mr. Peterson's offered, choose something easier, something safer. No one would blame him, but then he remembered his grandmother's apartment. The way she'd sit in her worn chair with the record player beside her, her eyes closed. Tears sometimes streaming down her face as she listened to this exact song. She'd told him once, the people who succeed aren't the ones without fear. They're the ones who sing anyway. Ryan picked up his phone and started the accompaniment track again. At home, his routine was just as intense. His mother worked the night shift at County General, usually leaving at 6 in the evening and returning around 3 in the morning. That gave Ryan hours to practice without worrying about disturbing her. He'd set up his grandmother's old record player in his room, along with the collection of opera recordings she'd left him. He'd sing along with the masters, trying to match their phrasing, their emotion. Sometimes he'd record himself, then listen back with headphones, cringing at all the mistakes. But slowly, gradually, he started to hear improvement. Notes that had been impossible last week were becoming possible this week. Passages that had left him breathless were becoming manageable. The problem was exhaustion. Between early morning practice, lunch practice, and late night practice, plus regular classes and homework, Ryan was running on maybe 4 hours of sleep a night. By the end of the first week, his eyes had dark circles under them. He'd started falling asleep in afternoon classes. Mrs. Chen noticed. One night she came home early from her shift. Someone had covered for her and found Ryan in his room at midnight, singing softly along with a recording. She stood outside his door, listening. She'd heard him practice before, of course, but never paid much attention. Music had been her mother's thing, not hers. But tonight, maybe because it was late and she was tired, or maybe because she recognized something in her son's voice, she really listened. When he finished, she knocked softly and opened the door. Ryan jumped, startled. "Mom, I'm sorry, did I wake you?" She shook her head, sitting down on the edge of his bed. "Ryan, what's going on? You look exhausted. And I found your progress report you're falling asleep in class." He explained everything. The talent show, the promise to his grandmother, the challenge from his teachers, the 2 weeks that were now down to 1. His mother listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You know, I used to resent your grandmother sometimes. She was so focused on music, so intense about it. I thought maybe she should lighten up, enjoy life more. But now I understand. The music wasn't separate from life for her. It was life." She reached over and brushed Ryan's hair out of his eyes, something she hadn't done since he was little. "You have her gift. I see that now. But you also need sleep, or you won't have the energy to use that gift. Promise me you'll rest more." "But I only have 1 week left. Promise me," she said firmly. Your grandmother wouldn't want you destroying yourself for this. She'd want you healthy and strong. Ryan nodded reluctantly. That night, for the first time in a week, he slept 6 full hours. Back at school, Mr. Peterson and Ms. Williams had been watching Ryan's dedication with growing amazement and concern. They'd see lights on in the auditorium before sunrise. They'd hear his voice echoing from the practice rooms during lunch. Other teachers had mentioned he was falling asleep in class. Maybe we pushed him too hard, Ms. Williams said one afternoon in the teacher's lounge. Or maybe we underestimated him, Mr. Peterson replied. I've been teaching for 20 years, and I've never seen a student work this hard for anything. They'd also been hearing the rumors. Students talked, and word had spread about Ryan's ambitious choice. Some were curious, some were skeptical, and some, like Tyler and his crowd, were openly mocking. The teachers had overheard conversations in the hallways, seen posts on social media. People were expecting a disaster. We should prepare him for the possibility that it won't go well, Ms. Williams suggested. Even with all this practice, it might not be enough. Mr. Peterson nodded, but privately, he wasn't so sure anymore. 3 days ago, he'd arrived early and heard Ryan practicing in the auditorium. He'd stood in the back, in the shadows where Ryan couldn't see him, and listened. What he'd heard had given him chills. It wasn't perfect. There were still rough spots, moments where the technique faltered, but there was something there. Something real and raw and honest that you couldn't teach. The last few days before the private audition were the hardest. Ryan's voice was getting tired from all the practice. He'd push too hard and end up hoarse, then have to rest it for a day, which made him anxious that he was losing progress. His confidence swung wildly. One moment he'd nail a difficult passage and feel invincible. The next he'd crack on an easy note and want to quit. On the morning of the 13th day, Ryan went to his grandmother's apartment. His mother had kept it exactly as it was, couldn't bring herself to clean it out or rent it to someone else. Ryan sat in her chair, the same one she'd sat in during those final months, and put on her favorite recording of Nessun Dharma. He closed his eyes and listened, not singing along, just listening. And he remembered her voice, not as it was at the end when cancer had stolen it, but as it had been in the stories she'd told him. Strong and clear and full of passion. She'd given everything to music, and music had given everything back. Tomorrow was the private audition. Tomorrow, Mr. Peterson and Ms. Williams would decide if 2 weeks of barely sleeping, barely eating, barely existing outside of this song had been enough. Ryan didn't know if he was ready. But as he sat in his grandmother's chair, surrounded by her memories and her music, he knew one thing for certain. He was going to try. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The day of the talent showcase arrived faster than Ryan expected. The auditorium buzzed with energy as students rushed around setting up equipment, testing microphones and running through last-minute rehearsals. Backstage was pure chaos. Answers stretching, comedians mumbling their jokes, musicians tuning instruments. Everyone dealt with their nerves differently. Ryan sat alone in the far corner, away from all the noise. He wore his grandfather's old suit, the one his mother had pulled from the back of the closet that morning. It was too big in the shoulders and the pants were a bit long, but his mother had insisted. Your grandfather wore this to every important occasion, she'd said, while adjusting his tie. He'd want you to have it. The suit smelled faintly of mothballs and old cologne. Ryan kept his hands folded in his lap to stop them from shaking. In his jacket pocket, he had a photo of his grandmother in her 20s. Standing on a stage somewhere in Seoul, mid-performance, her mouth open in song. He'd found it tucked inside one of her record sleeves. He touched the pocket now, feeling the edge of the photo through the fabric. The showcase had started at 7. It was now 8:45, and Ryan was scheduled to perform at 9. He'd watched from backstage as act after act took the stage. A dance crew that brought the audience to their feet. A girl who did a comedy routine that had everyone laughing. A band that covered a popular song and sounded almost professional. Every act seemed to raise the bar higher. Then there was the incident with Kevin Martinez. Kevin had been scheduled to play guitar and sing right before Ryan. He'd seemed confident during rehearsals, even cocky. But when he walked onto that stage and saw the packed auditorium, every seat filled, People standing in the back, something happened. He froze, just stood there at the microphone, guitar in hand, staring at the sea of faces. After 30 seconds of painful silence, Mr. Peterson had gently walked him off stage. The audience had been kind, clapping supportively. But Ryan had seen Kevin's face. Pure humiliation. That could be him in 15 minutes. Ryan's breathing became shallow. His chest felt tight. The practice rooms were one thing. The empty auditorium at 6 in the morning was another. But this. Hundreds of people all watching, all waiting to see if the quiet kid from the back of music class could actually pull off what he'd been crazy enough to attempt. Ryan? He looked up to see Mr. Peterson standing over him. The teacher's expression was serious, concerned. He gestured toward the hallway, away from the chaos of the backstage area. Ryan followed, grateful to get away from the noise. They walked to the empty music room. The same room where this had all started 2 weeks ago. The lights were off, except for the glow coming through the windows from the parking lot outside. Mr. Peterson sat on the edge of a desk, and Ryan remained standing, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "I saw what happened with Kevin," Mr. Peterson said quietly. "That's what I was worried about. That's why I wanted you to have an audition, a chance to back out if you needed to." Ryan nodded but didn't speak. "Here's the thing, Ryan. I'm going to give you one more chance. If this is too much, if you're not ready, we can adjust. You could sing something else, something simpler. Nobody out there knows what you've chosen. Or you could skip it entirely. Your name's near the end anyway. We could just say you weren't feeling well. It was an escape hatch. A way out with dignity intact. No one would judge him for backing down. In fact, most people would probably understand. Even his mother had told him that morning, if you change your mind, that's okay. Your grandmother would understand, but would she? Would she really? Ryan thought about those last few months with her. How she'd grown weaker, but more determined. How she'd made him practice, even on days when she could barely sit up in bed. How she'd listened to his attempts with such fierce concentration, stopping him whenever he took the easy way through a passage. The easy way teaches you nothing, she'd say. The struggle is where the music lives. "Mr. Peterson," Ryan said, his voice steadier than he felt, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. That private audition 2 weeks ago. When I sang for you and Ms. Williams, you never actually told me if I passed or not. You just said I could perform in the showcase if I wanted to." Mr. Peterson was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "You want the truth?" "Yes, you weren't perfect. There were rough spots, moments where the technique faltered. Your breath control in the middle section needs work, and the final note was sharp." He paused. "But here's what you were, Ryan. You were honest. You were real. And there was something in your performance that I haven't seen in 30 years of teaching. You weren't just singing notes. You were singing a story. Your story. Your grandmother's story." And felt his eyes getting hot but blinked the tears back. "So did I pass?" he asked. "I don't know," Mr. Peterson said honestly. "And I don't think that's the right question. The question is, do you believe you can do this? Not for me, not for the showcase, not even for your grandmother. Can you walk onto that stage and sing this song because you need to? Because something inside you will break if you don't." The question hit Ryan like a punch. He'd been so focused on the promise, on honoring his grandmother's memory, that he hadn't stopped to ask himself what he wanted. Did he want this? Or was he just trying to keep someone alive who was already gone? He closed his eyes and let himself remember. Not the sick grandmother in the hospital bed, but the one from before. The one who would cook him dinner and quiz him on music theory while stirring soup. The one who'd laugh when he hit a wrong note and say again, with feeling this time. The one who'd told him at the end, music is the only thing that doesn't die. "Ryan, when you sing, I'm still here. I need to do this," Ryan said, opening his eyes. "Not because it's impossible, or because I want to prove something. I need to do it because when I sing that song, I can still hear her voice, and I'm not ready to lose that yet." Mr. Peterson stood up and put a hand on Ryan's shoulder. "Then go sing it. And whatever happens, know that you've already done something brave just by trying." They walked back to the backstage area together. Ms. Williams was there, looking nervous. "Ryan, you're up in 5 minutes," she said. "How are you feeling?" "Terrified," he admitted. She smiled. "Good, that means you care." "The performers who aren't scared? They're usually not that good." The stage manager, a senior named Derek, who took his job way too seriously, called out, "Ryan Chen, you're next. Get ready at stage left." Ryan walked to the edge of the stage where he could peek out at the audience. The auditorium was somehow even more packed than before. He scanned the crowd and spotted his mother sitting in the 5th row. She'd gotten off work early, still wearing her nurse's scrubs. Their eyes met, and she placed her hand over her heart. Their signal. "I'm with you." He also spotted Tyler and his friends a few rows back, whispering to each other and laughing. Tyler caught Ryan looking and made an exaggerated, worried face, like he was watching a car crash about to happen. His friends cracked up. The current act finished up. The magician who'd actually been pretty good, and the audience applauded loudly. Derek tapped Ryan's shoulder. "You're up." Ryan stepped onto the stage. The lights were blindingly bright, making it impossible to see individual faces beyond the first few rows. Maybe that was better. He walked to the microphone at center stage. The murmur of conversation in the audience gradually died down. Mr. Peterson was standing in the wings. WATCHINGM's Williams sat at the piano, ready to accompany him. They'd offered to use a recording, but Ryan had asked for live accompaniment. "My grandmother always said real music happens between people, not through speakers," he'd explained. The whispers in the audience grew louder as people realized who was performing. "That's the quiet kid from 3rd period. What's he gonna do? Oh man, this is gonna be awkward." Ryan adjusted the microphone, which squealed with feedback for a second. Someone in the audience laughed. He felt sweat forming on his forehead, his heart hammering so hard he was sure the microphone would pick it up. This was it. The moment everything had been building toward. 2 weeks of 5:30 mornings and midnight practices. 2 weeks of exhaustion and doubt and pushing through anyway. A promise made to someone who couldn't see him keep it. He looked at Ms. Williams, who had her hands positioned over the keys. She gave him a questioning look. "Ready?" Ryan thought about his grandmother one more time. About the way she'd close her eyes when the music swelled, like she was somewhere else entirely. About how she'd told him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was singing the high note even when your voice might crack. He nodded at Ms. Williams. The opening notes of Nessun Dharma filled the auditorium, and Ryan began to sing. The first note that came out of Ryan's mouth silenced the auditorium instantly. It wasn't what anyone expected. Not from the kid who'd spent 3 years invisible in the back of every classroom. The voice that emerged was rich and full, carrying a weight that seemed impossible for someone his age. It filled every corner of the space, reaching the back rows and the balcony with effortless power. People who'd been whispering to their neighbors stopped mid-sentence. Students who'd had their phones out recording for social media lowered them slowly, forgetting to hit record. Even Tyler, who'd been prepared to laugh, sat frozen with his mouth slightly open. Ryan's eyes were closed. He wasn't seeing the auditorium anymore, wasn't thinking about the hundreds of people watching. He was somewhere else, entirely in his grandmother's apartment, with the late afternoon sun coming through the windows. Her old record player spinning, her voice telling him, "Feel every word. Ryan, this isn't just music. It's a story about refusing to surrender." The Italian words flowed from him like he'd been born speaking them. Nessun Dharma, none shall sleep. His grandmother had made him translate every line, understand every meaning. It wasn't enough to sing the sounds, she'd insisted. You had to sing the soul. Ms. Williams at the piano had tears forming in her eyes. But she kept playing, her fingers moving across the keys with practiced precision. She'd accompanied hundreds of students over her career, but this was different. She could feel it in the air, that rare moment when everything aligns and something magical happens in the audience. Ryan's mother had both hands pressed against her mouth. She was seeing her own mother in Ryan's face, hearing her mother's passion in Ryan's voice. All those years she'd thought her mother was too obsessed with music, too intense about it. Now she understood. This was what her mother had been trying to preserve. This gift, this ability to make people feel something deep and true. The song built gradually, each phrase more powerful than the last. Ryan's breath control, the thing he'd worried about most, held strong. All those early mornings practicing breathing exercises, all those nights falling asleep while counting breath patterns, it was paying off now. His voice soared through the auditorium without a single crack or waver. Mr. Peterson stood backstage, completely still. He was watching something he'd never quite seen before in his 3 decades of teaching. Technical skill could be taught, but what Ryan had couldn't be learned from any instruction. It was authenticity. It was someone singing not to impress or to win, but because they needed to. Because something inside them demanded to be expressed. The other performers backstage had stopped their conversations. Dancers who'd been stretching stood up. Musicians who'd been packing their instruments paused. Everyone was listening, drawn in by something they couldn't quite name, but could definitely feel. Ryan opened his eyes as he moved into the second verse. For a moment, the sight of all those faces watching him threatened to break his concentration. His heart skipped. This was the moment where nerves could destroy everything, where the weight of expectation could crush someone. But then he saw his mother. She'd lowered her hands from her mouth and was smiling through tears. And somehow, Ryan could almost see his grandmother sitting beside her in an empty seat. The way she used to sit when she was healthy. Leaning forward with that intense focus she had when she listened to music she loved, the fear evaporated. He wasn't performing for the crowd anymore. He was singing for the woman who'd given him this gift, who'd spent her last years making sure it wouldn't die with her. And suddenly, the auditorium full of people didn't feel scary. It felt like an honor. All these witnesses to a promise being kept. The music swelled as Ryan approached the climax everyone was waiting for. Even people who'd never heard opera knew this part. It was the moment that separated the amateurs from the masters. The part that required not just technical skill, but something more: courage, conviction. The willingness to put everything you had into a single phrase. Vincero. The word exploded from Ryan with a power that seemed to shake the walls. I will win. I will conquer. His voice hit the high note with crystal clarity, holding it with a strength that made people's skin prickle. It wasn't just a sound, it was a declaration. A 17-year-old kid telling the universe that he'd done what seemed impossible, that he'd kept his promise. That love and dedication could overcome doubt and fear. The final phrases of the aria carried that same intensity. Ryan poured everything into them all, the grief of losing his grandmother. All the exhaustion from 2 weeks of relentless practice, all the fear he'd felt standing in the wings, all the love he had for a woman who'd given him so much and asked for so little in return. When the last note faded, there was a moment of absolute silence. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, though. It was the kind of silence that happens when an audience needs a second to process what they've just experienced. When something is so good, so unexpectedly powerful, that people need time to let it sink in. Ryan stood at the microphone, breathing hard, his grandfather's too big suit damp with sweat. He looked out at the sea of faces, suddenly aware again of where he was, of what he'd just done. Then the auditorium erupted. The sound was deafening. People didn't just clap, they jumped to their feet, shouting and cheering. The standing ovation was immediate and universal. Students who'd been preparing to mock him were on their feet screaming. Teachers who'd seen countless performances were applauding with tears running down their faces. Parents who'd come just to watch their own kids were blown away by what they'd witnessed. Tyler, who'd been ready to post a video making fun of Ryan, had his phone forgotten in his lap. He was clapping harder than anyone around him, shaking his head in disbelief. That was insane, he kept saying to his friends. That was absolutely insane. The ovation went on and on. 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes. People couldn't stop. It was like they needed to match the intensity of what they'd heard with the intensity of their response. Ryan just stood there, overwhelmed. He'd imagined this moment going well, but he'd never imagined this. He looked to the wings and saw Mr. Peterson with his hand over his mouth. Shoulders shaking with emotion, Ms. Williams had stood up from the piano, applauding along with everyone else, not bothering to hide her tears. then Ryan's mother was moving. She got up from her seat and started walking toward the stage. She wasn't supposed to. Parents were meant to stay seated, but she didn't care. She climbed the stage steps, still in her nurse's scrubs, and walked straight to her son. She hugged him tight, and Ryan finally let himself cry. Not sad tears, but the kind that come when something huge releases from inside you. When you've carried something heavy for so long, and finally get to put it down. She heard you, his mother whispered in his ear. Wherever she is, she heard you. And she's so proud, the audience, seeing this moment between mother and son, somehow applauded even louder. Mr. Peterson and Ms. Williams came onto the stage. They'd tested Ryan with an impossible song, never really believing he could do it. They'd given him the challenge partly to protect him, to make him see reason and choose something safer. But he'd proven them wrong in the most beautiful way possible. "I'm sorry," Mr. Peterson said, pulling Ryan into a hug after his mother stepped back. "I'm sorry we doubted you. I'm sorry we almost held you back from this." "You didn't hold me back," Ryan said, his voice hoarse from singing and crying. "You challenged me. That's different. My grandmother would have done the same thing." Miss Williams hugged him next. "In 30 years of teaching," she said, "I've never heard anything like that. You didn't just sing that song, Ryan. You lived it." The ovation was still going, showing no signs of stopping. Finally, Derek, the stage manager, came out and gently moved everyone off stage so the showcase could continue. But it didn't matter what came after. Everyone knew. This was the performance people would remember. It's the one they'd talk about for years. Backstage, students who'd barely spoken to Ryan before lined up to congratulate him. Some wanted pictures with him. Others just wanted to shake his hand, to be able to say they were there, that they'd witnessed it. Later, after the showcase ended and most people had left,
Ryan sat alone in the empty auditorium.
He was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical. He felt like he'd run a marathon and climbed a mountain and swum across an ocean all at once. He pulled the photograph from his jacket pocket. His grandmother on stage in Seoul, young and healthy and mid-performance. He looked at it for a long time, tracing her face with his finger. "I kept my promise," he whispered to the empty room. The music didn't die. Sitting there in his grandfather's suit, in the auditorium that was still somehow filled with the echo of his voice, Ryan finally felt something he hadn't felt since his grandmother was passed away. He felt complete. The quiet kid who'd spent 3 years hiding in the back of every classroom wasn't that kid anymore. He'd become someone who understood what his grandmother had been trying to teach him all along. That the greatest performances aren't about perfection. They're about truth. They're about having the courage to share something real and deep and human with the world. Even when you're terrified, they're about keeping promises to the people we love. Even after they're gone, especially after they're gone. Ryan stood up, carefully folded the photograph, and put it back.